Blitz. Very much. Hello. It's good to be here. Good to do stuff. Hold on. Let's go here. All right. I always analyze and overanalyze my talk in the lead up to it. And then you get that handsome Swede up here doing everything. You're not going to see more of a contrast between his high energy and whatever it is I'm bringing you. So some contrast. These talks are kind of weird, not in a terrible way, but they're not sermons and they're not lectures. It's kind of like a mixture of the two. Have you thought about that? They're great, but that's great because some people, they're preachers and they give sermons, and then there are people who are professors and give lectures. I don't do any of that anymore. I literally do one thing just over and over and over again. And so I thought maybe I'd be a little more comfortable. Where to go? Let's do a live reading of the Christian History Almanac. You can close your eyes if you want, pretend I'm not here. Is that coming through? Coming through? Yeah, you're gonna see the guy with the voice do the thing. I hope it doesn't weird you out. Okay. Nope, turn it off. It is the 14th of October, 2022. Welcome to a special live edition of the Christian History Almanac, brought to you by 1517 at 1517.org. I'm Dan Van Voorhis. So when I thought I was doing a live almanac reading, I wondered if I could find anything on this day that was specifically tied to the Reformation, and given my task of doing a brief history of what led to Luther's famous stand. Friends, I could not have been any more pleased to see that it was on this, the 14th of October in 1465, that the antiquarian and humanist Conrad Pottinger died, a man whose life embodies much of the spirit of pre-Reformation and Renaissance Europe, who was also a first-person witness to Luther at the Diet of Worms when Luther made his stand. So let me tell you a bit about Conrad Pottinger. He was born in Augsburg, and like so many of his late 15th century fellow students, studied law. Canon law was the most useful degree for future work, but he also studied the human writings as opposed to the divine writings, what we today call humanism. As you will hear in just a bit, this was a crucial ingredient for the coming Reformation. It sent Conrad through Padua, Bologna, Florence, and Rome in the 1480s. Here he would develop a love for antiquity. And back home in Augsburg, he was known for his home opposite the great Augsburg Cathedral, which became a veritable museum of coins and inscriptions and maps. He developed a love for the new discipline of archaeology, the idea that we could unearth and learn something from the past. Back in Augsburg, he was named as an official chronicler for the city, that is, kind of like an archivist and public historian. It was here that he would meet the young German king, Maximilian, soon to become the Holy Roman Emperor, who would have to deal with Luther and the Reformation. And Maximilian then had a problem with the Alsace, that peculiar place, a one-time French region and German territory. Back in the 1470s, the Habsburg Sigismund gave the territory to Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, for French help for the Habsburgs against the Swiss. But when the Habsburgs and Swiss signed a treaty, Sigismund wanted the Alsace back. This led to the Burgundian Wars. With the land contested between the French and Germans, Pottinger entered the fray with a bit of anti-French propaganda by way of his chosen field of study. Pottinger published his Sermons on the Marvelous Antiquities of Germany, a work that argued that the disputed Alsace was historically German and not French. This made him a friend to the now Emperor Maximilian, who would make Conrad one of his most trusted advisors. When Maximilian died, Pottinger had a similar relationship with Maximilian's successor, Charles V. And it was his friendship with Charles that led Conrad to be the representative from Augsburg at the Diet of Worms. But Pottinger didn't agree with his friend the emperor and found Luther rather convincing. In fact, Pottinger in 1530 presented the protest that included the Augsburg Confession to the emperor on behalf of the city. But Pottinger, the politician, would only have things done in order. And when the people of Augsburg decided to reform without consulting the clerics and the clerks, Pottinger left his post and quietly retired. He suggested a council to resolve the issue, but the time for conciliar actions had passed. Conrad would continue working in the field of archaeology and antiquities until his death in 1547. Born on this, the 14th of October in 1465, Conrad Pottinger was 82 years old. And we're doing the whole show. The last word for today, which isn't the last word, but go with me, comes from the daily lectionary from 2 Timothy 2:14. Keep reminding God's people of these things. Warn them before God against quarreling about words. It is of no value and only ruins those who listen. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly handles the word of truth. This has been a special live edition of the Christian History Almanac for the 14th of October, 2022, brought to you by 1517 at 1517.org. This show is usually produced by a man whose favorite Conrads include Pottinger, hotel magnate Conrad Hilton, and Conrad Bain, who played Philip Drummond in Different Strokes. What you talking about, Christopher Gillespie. The show is written and read by a man who wants to give a shout out to all of you who came from the lands of Big 10, Big 12, and SEC. Welcome to USC country, where we will continue to steal your coaches and players. I'm Dan Van Voorhis. It's Trooper 6-0. You guys help me out. You can catch us here every day, and remember that the rumors of grace, forgiveness, and the redemption of all things are true. Everything is going to be okay. Fantastic. All right, well, that's my time. Luckily, the Christian History Almanac has recently expanded, and we now have a weekend edition. So you are now going to get a live weekend edition of the Christian History Almanac for you and you only, and the streamers, I'm told. I was asked by Dan to talk about a brief history of Luther's stand, and if you know anything about the weekend edition, one of the things I like to do is I like to make lists. And so we are going to do a top 10 list, the 10 ideas and events that led to Martin Luther's stand. Now, I love counting things down. It lets you know when we're almost done, because if you zone out for one, then you hear me say number 5, just jump right back in. Just be fine. Thinking about you guys. And like with the Almanac, I have peppered my talk with some obscure references that I don't expect many to get. They are put in simply for my delight and for those eagle-eared listeners who also love the obscure facts and references. You're going to see the other side of it, and just real fast. Yes, I move my hands this much when I'm sitting alone in my room recording the show, and I feel ridiculous, but I feel like that's how you hit the conductor arms is how you hit points. A number of times there's me saying something like, let's go here. Luckily, I have a new addition to the Almanac. I've got clips of that just over and over and over, and so if I make any mistakes, you can. It's what it's really like. All right, so the story starts with Luther. So why don't I do a short story, a biography of Luther, just up to when he gets to Worms, and then we will start the top 10 list. Martin Luther was a weird guy, seriously. Obsessed with bodily functions, prone to bouts of depression and manic writing. He could be gracious and generous and vindictive and mean. He saw himself as both a humble Saxon professor and an apocalyptic prophet of doom. He was brilliant and obsessed, primarily obsessed with the grace of God and that it could reach a man such as him even at his worst. Recently, one author wrote that he was, quote, not a man of heroic virtues. That's an interesting take. You're playing with heroic there, so I might question him. but the point stands. Luther was larger than life spiritually and physically. And frankly, I think this is better news than the Luther of the last Luther movie. Joseph Fiennes, right? Very attractive, very svelte. I like that we have the svelte Luther up here. I'm sure he appreciates that too. I don't know if you've seen the picture of me in The Thing, but it's also very different, so I can relate. Oh, you got a picture when oh yeah, use that one. Where was I? Thinking about Joseph Fiennes. Oh, he's so attractive. I think it's good news that he was as he thought, as he told us he was, not a great guy. I think that's good news that our heroes don't have to be that heroic in that sense. But I think we want to look at Luther like the historical record shows him. We want to see him as he was, as a sinner, and also as someone who is able to take an idea so basic and almost already known, and put it in language such that people could understand it. Remember, Luther's not inventing anything. The major breakthrough of the gospel, this isn't invented. This is Luther coming up with a new way to say, this is how it is. I think you get it like this. A remarkable man in that sense. Luther was born in 1483 in Eisleben, Germany. The Luther family moved to Mansfeld on account of his father's booming business in copper refining, a position that would have made the family what we might consider today upper middle class. And the fact that his family owned a business, it would make sense that Luther would go into law. Yes, it was church law, but this was the most important kind of law when the church had its fingers in all aspects of life. When Luther had a crisis of conscience and entered the Augustinian monastery, take note of that Augustinian part, we'll come back to it, it understandably angered his father, who would have dreams of creating a generations-long Luther copper mining dynasty. Luther disappointing his earthly father would certainly have repercussions for how he would also then see his heavenly Father. Now, I want to make two quick notes about Luther's education. The first is when he was a young boy, he went to a school that was run by the Brethren of the Common Life. So remember that, Brethren of the Common Life. That's going to come up later. And then when Luther went to college, he primarily studied what we call today the scholastics. Okay, these are the cats that are going to show up a little bit later, and you want to remember them. Next, if we talk about his younger life, his 95 theses are less a deal than they have been made out to be. There was a recent thing you may have seen on the internet going around of the most important theological works, and it's an interesting list, to say the least. But one of the weirdest things is the 95 Theses are like number 3 or 4. That Luther would never say that, nor would Lutherans. How many of you have read all 95 Theses? No, the first one is enough. It's an important document for many, many reasons. But that's not the book. The real books are what Luther would write in 1520. The first, to the Christian nobility of the German nation, wherein he calls on the German nobility to assist his cause. Same year, on the freedom of the Christian, where he claims that the Christian is perfectly free with regards to salvation, perfectly bound to their neighbor. And the Babylonian captivity of the church, which attacked the sacramental system and argued that there were not 7 sacraments, but only 3. These were the major writings that he was called upon to recant when he went to the Diet of Worms, where Conrad Pottinger was hanging out. I enjoyed that synchronicity. It's important to remember that Luther thought he was going to his death at Worms. He was granted safe passage, but so was Jan Hus 100 years prior, and that ended in flames and tears. What surprised Luther when he got to the city was to see throngs of his fans lining the streets. Luther had become a celebrity. Some have argued the first modern celebrity, and the points made there aren't bad. But when Luther got there, he wanted to debate the texts. He was only given an ultimatum: recant or else. He asked for a day to think of it. That's when he comes back and ultimately states, "Unless I am convinced by Scripture and plain reason, I do not accept the authority of the popes and councils, for they have contradicted each other. My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. God help me. Amen." What's not there? Here I stand, I can do no other. It is a nice sentiment. It is possible that he said it. Let's do, if you have, over here, we'll do George Washington cut down the cherry tree, and over here is Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game. I'm going to put "here I stand" right about here. Right about here. But it's an interesting debate. So the point is that Luther was kind of a weird dude. And by the time he made his stand, the cumulative effect of past events, the past events we will be discussing now, had made the Reformation an almost inevitable runaway train of a movement that subsequent generations up to our own would have to wrestle with, tame, and interpret. It's what every movement has to do. So now, on to my list of the top 10 things that historically made the Reformation. Please note, they are in some order of importance. We can debate them, of course. You can wager. And let's get started. Now, it's not actually 10 things, it was 9 things, but the 9th thing was 3 things, so will you cut me some slack? Cool, thank you, all right. Number 10 and 9. Mongols, Turks, and plague. Forget Kevin Bacon. I like to play 6 Degrees of Genghis Khan. Luckily, his amorous ways mean that he has more descendants than maybe any character in world history. And sure, he dies centuries before the Reformation, but it was his Mongol horde which swept westward from the Eurasian steppes that set up systems of remote rule and tribute. This would put a crush on would-be Middle Eastern empires that would have to be squeezed to the west. This would importantly include the Ottomans, known in Canada as a Chesterfield. And of course, in 1453, these Ottomans had moved. It's a kind of sofa, kids. All right. Okay. Ottomans had moved into and taken Constantinople. Now it's Istanbul. Why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks. Say it with me. All right. Now you've made it. See, I'm glad that you're not in my room when I read this. I never get it done. All right, so yeah, Constantinople, Istanbul. And then you get the Siege of Rhodes and the Battle of Mohacs. And European leaders, both religious and secular, they knew they had to keep their guard up. And a good number of the German lands that took to the teachings of Luther, this is where they would get their mercenaries, making it all the more unlikely that the emperor or pope could afford to alienate those Germans. And it wasn't just the horde that plagued the West, it was a literal plague. It was Mongol traders that brought the Yersinus pestis bacterium that would devastate Europe in what we now call the Black Death, starting in 1346. I can't stress how much the Black Death changed everything. In Europe and the Mediterranean, between 35% and 60% of the population died. Could you imagine being in a village where 60% of the population died? Economically and politically, it's going to affect trade routes and production. After the initial devastation, you had all sorts of social unrest, demand for workers. This would lead to increased wages, a period of decreased inequality, but then the powerful and the wealthy made sure that something could be done with it. With power and wealth on the decrease, this would perhaps be panicked means of showing off power with ostentatious displays and extravagant shows of wealth. Theologically, there is a mess of things we could discuss. Sure, people were simply devastated by the idea that God would let this happen. Not to mention, priests died at a higher rate than any other profession in the Black Death, to the best that we can tell. It must be that they're cursed, or they're the ones with the sick, and such that they die at a higher rate. But it certainly affected how people thought about death, because they were thinking about it a lot. In Christian theology, you guys know this, it's a very stark ending. There's heaven or hell. Those are the only two options. This is going to lead us to number 8. That is an economy of sin and salvation. I'll tell you a secret from me, a good Protestant boy. Purgatory seems like kind of a good idea. Like, I'm not saying it's true, but it might help me sleep a little better if I knew there was that wiggle room place for those that need the wiggle room. And I know the death and resurrection of Jesus is so powerful that I need not worry. Don't worry about my soul. But I can see why it was popular. And in fact, it was one of the hardest doctrines for many Reformation-era Christians to get rid of. It wasn't, I think, till 1530 that Luther finally said, okay, we'll get away with that. We'll do away with it. It was an incredibly popular doctrine. As the doctrine went, the merits of Christ could be earned through acts of faithfulness, primarily through someone saying a mass on your behalf. And if we could earn that merit for ourselves, I bet we could do it for others, like the dead. And so soon, an entire economy grows up around this seemingly comforting doctrine. And once it started making money, it would take a lot to get rid of it. I'm going to tie this in here with a revolution in banking. This is the era of the big names like the Medicis. I'll still never get it right. Is Sam here? All right. Oh, okay. All right. She would have told me. This is the time of those guys and the Fuggers. They were able to consolidate money and power in many ways, and this is beyond the scope of the talk, but one of the ways they did so was by better bookkeeping. That's right, friends and students who have heard me bang on this for years. Double entry bookkeeping. Ledgers, whereby you could see what's coming out, what's coming in, and what's going out. If you're over, 65, or my wife, you might have a checkbook, and you write the note to the person. It's the weirdest thing. But you know what I'm saying. You can see everything there, hypothetically. And this would have a theological impact. If we're trying to level our accounts with the merits of Christ that can be earned, graciously, of course, but still earned, this provides a handy picture of the economy of our salvation, our sins and merits, and that for our loved ones. So we have the Black Death, banking, and it's all tied together, along with what might sound like an obscure philosophical school coming in at number 7. Number 7 is nominalism. Nominalism. I don't want to upset any philosophy professors here, so I'll do real short. Essentially, nominalism denies that there are universals, universal categories. And it says that things are not the things they are because, there are universals up here. And everything you see is just a reflection of that universal. This is a kind of scholastic teaching, right? And it comes to us in Plato and Aristotle. So for them, there is not just dogs, but there is dogness. And everything comes back down to the individual dogs. That's scholastic thinking. It's what Luther and so many grew up studying and thinking. And who was the king of translating that idea, or Aristotle particularly, to the church? Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas would, of course, then formulate the doctrine of the Lord's Supper. This is a big deal, because what does he teach? Real fast, that there is the substance that you're looking at, the essence of a thing, and then its accidents, the things that don't have to be there to make it what it is. What happens in the Lord's Supper, according to Aquinas, the substance is transformed, leaving only the accidents behind, transubstantiation. The accidents of bread and wine stay the same, what they look like. But the substance is actually the flesh and blood of our resurrected Lord. It's a very big deal that there was a philosophy in nominalism to come along to say, not only is that not right, Aristotle's not right, and Aquinas isn't right. This is the kind of philosophy that Luther would learn that he was taught in school. The nominalists also saw changes in economics, how the big banks created wealth the way they did. And they noticed that in lean times, or times of massive expansion, it wasn't always possible for the bank to have the actual thing, the precious metal, to back the banknote. And so sometimes banknotes were given based on fiat alone. There's no inherent worth in it. Nominalists use this to say, this is what our good works are like. They're not really worth anything, but God deigns they're worth something. It's essentially like one of those Fugger banknotes. This would help them square the Augustinian notion of fallen humanity, we can't really do anything, we're not righteous, with the claims of the church that we can somehow merit anything towards salvation. God doesn't need our good works, they're worthless, but God has designed to give full faith and credit to the person who has the indulgence or is doing the best they can. The official phrase, God does not deny grace to those who do what is within them. These nominalists with their banking ideas tried to square sin and grace. And all of this leads us to number 6. It's one of the big A's if you are a listener to the show. That's right, Augustine, not a city in Florida, but the saint and bishop of Hippo. Let's call number 6 an Augustinian death match against itself. It was in the book Calvin and Augustine that the giant of Reformed theology, B.B. Warfield, wrote, "The Reformation inwardly considered was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over Augustine's doctrine of the church." The Reformation was a triumph of Augustine's grace over his teaching about the church. His teaching on the church was that if God is your father, the church is your mother. Listen to her, obey. There's no salvation outside the church. And now, how would you square that with the medieval church if you wanted to keep Augustine's doctrines of grace? You've got people reading Augustine trying to square the teaching of the medieval church. You can do something to affect your salvation, and Augustinian teaching on grace and sin. But Augustine would have us obey our mother church. In the Reformation, it is his followers that promote the doctrine of grace over his teaching on the church. And we noted that Luther had studied scholasticism, nominalism, that he entered an Augustinian monastery. All of these things are tied together. But his first school was run, I told you, by the Brethren of the Common Life, a significant group. This was a religious order that practiced the devotio moderna, a new spirituality, and it saw the worth of common life, everyday vocations. You didn't have to enter a monastery. These were the people who taught Luther. And this takes us to number 5. They were mystics. Number 5, mysticism. Mysticism as a reason the Reformation came about. And I don't find it odd that many reformers, including Luther, had an affinity for those late medieval mystics. After all, these were the rebels of their age. They were the anti-authoritarian folk that taught that you didn't need an intermediary to experience God. Like the Reformation, mysticism was an attack on a supposed false authority. And I think it's fair to suggest where the reformers would put the scriptures, the mystics would put the spirit. So they're different systems, but they have similarities. And there was a popular earthiness to many of the mystics. Consider one of Luther's favorites, Bernard of Clairvaux. You might know him best as the author behind the hymn, "O Sacred Head Now Wounded." Texts like The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis from the Brethren of the Common Life, he would stress devotion to Christ, who was now, interestingly, being pictured as a suffering servant. After the Black Death, the confident Europeans stopped making everything an art about the God who's going to judge you, because that got scary fast. And you start to see the turn towards the image of Christ as the suffering servant. The stress on the crucified Christ was seen in devotion and art as the triumphalism of the High Middle Ages came crashing down. The link between mysticism and Luther would be noted by second and third generation theologians combating Protestant scholasticism. It's an interesting story. But now we get to number 4. The number 4 event or idea that sparked the Reformation and Luther's stand, it is a love affair with the past. We saw this in Conrad Pottinger, studying archaeology, the new field. We see this in the rallying cry of the Renaissance, which was ad fontes, or back to the sources, back to the originals. At worst, this can kind of seem like a primitivism that sees the past as the panacea for everything. At its worst, it's a fetish for the so-called golden age. But at its best, this obsession with the past can help us reevaluate our sources and ask questions about how we do things today. We see this idea in the very name the Italians gave their intellectual movement. The Renaissance. It means rebirth. A rebirth of what? The classical age. Greece and Rome. Petrarch wanted to be the Roman orator, Cicero in parallel perhaps to Luther wanting to be the African bishop, Augustine. This leads us to number 3, popular expectations. With this rebirth, Renaissance, and Reformation, we're going to see a third era named. That's the time between the fall of Rome, 500, to the present, around 1500. What were those then? They were, the Dark Ages, because now we've been reborn. Or maybe they'll call them the Middle Ages, also a little conceited. Or they'll call it the fancy Latin name, medieval. You know what that means? Middle. So there's nothing good about that word, because they were slogging around back in those days when there was a great schism, when there was 3 popes all of a sudden, back when there was invasions from Vikings in the north and Muslims in the Holy Land. But now they thought things are getting better. And while we're highlighting Luther's reform, it was central because it wasn't the first. We see reform movements around him at the Council of Constance. Yes, the council that also burned Jan Hus is also where we see the birth of conciliarism. That is the power of the church council. That is, if the church council calls the pope, the church council has more authority than the pope. And at 1415, at this council, they decide they're going to have councils every 10 years. We're going to reform ourselves. We have popular reform movements in the 1400s in Spain, the Netherlands, and Eastern Europe, where Hus remained a hero and a Czech church gained a bit of independence from Rome. The fact is, in many ways, the church on the eve of the Reformation was popular. And that's part of the success of the Reformation. And this is oftentimes a catalyst for revolution. It might not seem like it, but the people experience conditions getting better and better and better, right? And they expect continual exponential growth and improvement, and when that doesn't happen, you get people already plugged into the system turning against the system. Think about the last controversy at your local church. Maybe it was a bit of stained glass or remodeling the sanctuary, a new hymnal perhaps, which I hear is just like the worst. Who's causing a fuss? Is it the people who don't come to church very often? Or the zealous ones? Zealous ones. The church on the eve of the Reformation was popular. Purgatory was popular. It doesn't make any of it right. Let's come to number 2. Number 2, we have imperial politics and a church fragmented across nations. Remember, all of this in the 1500s is happening in the final throes of Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire, that First Reich. It had a tenuous hold on the people of Europe and the church. First, popes were now like kings. They had been elevated. They were given temporal authority. Consider Pope Alexander VI, who in 1494 divvied up the entire world between Spain and Portugal with the Treaty of Tordesillas. There was the matter of Pope Julius II, named for Julius Caesar. Dude had his own army. They were powerful, and so the power of the state and the emperor was down. The emperor would have to fend off rival kings as well as popes. Let's go back to Luther at the Diet of Worms. He was called in 1521, and who was he called to talk to? We talk a lot about this. He even gets colored red hair. And Who's this over here? Someone say Chuck, and I appreciate that. Charles V, that's what we call him. It was the emperor. Why is the emperor getting involved? This is a pope. Whoa, the pope already excommunicated him. This was a political body, not a church body. The pope had made up his mind and excommunicated Luther earlier in the year. And one of the reasons that Luther wasn't squashed like Huss and the other heretics was because of his powerful patron, Frederick V, the Elector of Saxony. Despite Frederick's ambivalence towards Luther's reform, and the fact that the two never met, Frederick liked having a popular new university and was an elector. That is, he was one of the men in Europe who elected the emperor. It wasn't a hereditary position. So you had to court the favor of all of those. Frederick the Wise was one of them. The Luther movement succeeded where others failed, in large part due to his patron. And the number one event or idea behind the Reformation and Luther stand, new technology, namely printing. And I know, I get it. Sometimes when we make lists, we want to be clever, right? Put something in at number one to get everyone talking. But there's a reason Michael Jackson's Thriller was always the number one video on the MTV Countdown. The reason Jordan is the best basketball player of all time. And you go, yeah, you give us LeBron stuff. Who do you need to win championships? Jordan's doing it by himself. Sorry. I've got a lot of thoughts about this. Okay, so, and then, I'm sorry, back to the kids. I'm sorry. And unfortunately, Tom Brady is the best quarterback of all time. Sorry, I had to write that one. It's just true. Sometimes there's just a number one, and Gutenberg's invention is that. The ability to change text, mass-produce woodcuts, it solidified in the average person's mind that something printed is inherently trustworthy. And just as we have the refrain today, just because it's on the internet, we have people then warning, just because it's printed. But just like today, it doesn't matter. Win the printing battle, win the soul of the people. And the printing blitz of the Reformation is staggering. I'm just going to let one historian, Alec Ryrie, I'm going to read what he wrote. During his 30-year public career, Luther produced 544 separate books, pamphlets, or articles. Slightly more than even Chad Bird. Whoa. Sorry. Why is Alec punching a Chad Bird? Sorry. Wait. There we go. Slightly more than one every 3 weeks. At his peak in 1523, he managed 55. That year, 390 separate editions of his books, new and old, were published. Luther alone was responsible for over a fifth of the entire output of pamphlets by German presses during the 1520s. One scholar has totaled up the totals for his rivals and supporters and included the top 17 pro-Lutheran pamphleteers. They all produced 807 editions between 1518 and 1525. Luther, nearly twice as many, 1,465. The numbers are staggering. It was the printing press. It was Luther, even Luther the sinner. It was all of these things that came together. Printed works mass-produced, increased literacy will come from this. All of this is happening in step with the Reformation. Printing and Protestant reform is interlocked in this way. And of course, it took the Mongols, Turks, and plague, an economy of sin and salvation, nominalism, Augustine's doctrines of grace trumping his doctrine of the church, mysticism, a love affair with the past, popular expectations, imperial politics, and then printing. And so I thought, as we do on the Soul of Christianity, my other podcast with Debbie, we finish up with what did we learn? What might we learn from this sort of history lesson all of a sudden just thrown on you? And I thought I was at a conference. And, I told you it was going to be weird. All right, yeah, we're good. Learning the context of the Reformation requires us to see that God is the God of history, but through means. That is through vocation. All of these things happen because of people having their different jobs and doing them faithfully. And sure, we talk about Maximilian and Frederick and Luther and the like, but it only works because they have movements to lead, movements with people, and the people that set up the chairs, that contribute in other ways. The very important but unseen. So vocation, that's number one. Number two, the importance of technology. The church has long been the center of technology and has benefited greatly from it. To go back to the Middle Ages, what was the technology on the cutting edge? Pipe organs, clocks. And where do we find them? In churches. That certain tools or techne are outside the scope of what a Christian might use seems to fit some modern sensibilities, some fundamentalisms, but it's not in line with the historical practice of the church adopting and adapting technology for the sake of the gospel. And my last point, so many of the events that brought Luther to Wittenberg and then to Worms were unpredictable, or they barely happened. It's a miracle of a million small little things happening. And for me, the point there is humility, especially when someone asks me what's going to happen next. It's never the story we expect. We move forward in awe of the story behind us, knowing that we move forward humbly, serving our neighbor in our vocations. It's the cumulative of all of these things that make the big things happen. Thank you very much.